Today we're talking about something most people missed in the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. What we're going to be looking at is some of the incentive programs in there and how they fit into a global policy platform. What that global policy platform is and how that not only incentivizes U.S. interests but incentivizes the US in a global economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at all of these step by step. We're going to go through first the framework of what the structure is for this. We're going to review some sources on some broader geopolitical perspectives, and then from there we're going to kind of tidy it up and showcase how this little known and little recognized area of this policy platform is actually a massive economic driver and a huge win for the United States economy. So, let's dive in. What we have in front of us is a summary, and this is directly from Senate documentation. If you look at the URL, you could see it's democrats.senate.gov. Obviously, you could say this document has bias because it's from the Democrats. That's neither here nor there for the context of this conversation. What we see right here is one of the flagship parts of this bill is its focus on investing in domestic energy production and manufacturing. So what this means on a concrete level is that there's a lot of incentives built into this program and built into this bill that helps build U.S. manufacturing capacity in the renewable space, for energy production, for manufacturing, for supply chain, etc. Right over here, you can see the focus on manufacturing jobs, with over $60 billion of the bill slated to go into domestic manufacturing. But that's not the whole story. So for this next part, I want to make sure that I credit this YouTube channel. It's called Caspian Report, and his video called How Biden Plans to Checkmate China. What I'll do is, instead of playing the video, I'll give you a brief summary of the points. I highly recommend you watch the video on your own. As you can see, I have it showcased right here. Take the time, check it out. Great video, highly recommend it. So some of you might remember in the later Obama years, there was a trade deal being negotiated that got a lot of attention. It was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some people were for it, some people were against it. There were some clauses in it that people were not the biggest fans of. I'm not going to go into it right now. But the basic premise was that the United States wanted to establish trade agreements with many countries in Southeast Asia. And so when we look at what the Biden administration is currently doing, the Biden administration is building on the foundation that the Trans-Pacific Partnership aimed to build and combining it with a geopolitical strategy that focuses on the economic risk presented by China. And what do I mean by the economic risk presented by China? So just with the quick Google search right here for Chinese material exports, you can see that of the biggest exports by China, you're looking at electrical machinery, number one. You're looking at machinery including computers, number two. Furniture, bedding, lighting, etc. That's, neither here nor there. Plastics as well. But the top two is electrical machinery as well as machinery including computers. Now, when you're living in an increasingly digitizing world, having your supply chain be significantly reliant on an oftentimes confrontational trade partner can be problematic. And what trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership try to accomplish is they try to create a network of trade partners where trade can happen freely, where it can happen easily between the organizations and countries involved. Now, the last element of this puzzle to pull together is a basic understanding of what China's Belt and Road Initiative is. So, just doing a quick Google search here, nothing fancy. You can look this up on your old Google Belt and Road Initiative, go to images, you'll see all these images. The basic premise of what's going on here is that China recognizes that strategically they lose whenever they go into full-on conflict. That's not really what they want to do. What they want to do is they want to have economic power over their partners. And so what they've done is they've built out this program called Belt and Road Initiative. It's actually modeled off of some of the debt traps that the U.S. did in South American and Central American countries in the 1980s. The basic premise of the model is superpower comes in and they lend money for infrastructure projects to developing countries. Those developing countries are almost expected to default on the debt. And then at that point, the superpower can come in and own the infrastructure instead of having the debt paid back. So the US has done this in South America, Central America for decades. And China has been doing this especially in Africa, but across the Eastern world as well. And going all the way into Europe in order to have soft power over countries that they engage with and that they choose to engage with. So China has been aggressively expanding their economic footprint and their soft power across the world, reaching all the way to Western Europe, using the Belt and Road Initiative, using the infrastructure projects, using the debt traps that those infrastructure projects are designed to create. And so when you combine the fact that you have China aggressively expanding their soft power through the Belt and Road Initiative, and when you combine the fact that the U.S. economy and U.S. national security interests are to a certain degree at risk from the reliance on a China-based supply chain, you start to see a situation where as China's economic interest and soft power expands, and as the U.S., due to decades of outsourcing, is increasingly reliant and dependent on those Chinese networks for their supply chains, you start to see a picture of a national security risk presenting. And we saw this during COVID. During COVID, at the worst, when supply chains were interrupted, we saw it in the grocery stores where basic supplies were not able to get to consumers because of the fact that we were reliant on international shipping and logistics, much of which was based out of Chinese factories, facilities, manufacturing, and logistics. So how does this tie into the Inflation Reduction Act? How does this tie into the Biden administration's deciding to create incentives for domestic productions? How does this tie into the inability of the Obama administration to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership? How do all of these puzzle pieces fall together? Over here, we have an article from Forbes. I believe that this was published today on the date of this video. However, these premises were built into the Inflation Reduction Act that passed a few weeks ago. Over here is the key element. So for materials used in the renewable supply chain, when we're talking about domestic manufacturing incentives, when we're talking about renewable incentives built into the Inflation Reduction Act, when we're talking about the economic progress that comes from localizing our supply chain, when we're talking about reducing the national security risk from localizing our supply chain, what we start to see, the Biden administration recognizes that national security threat and wants to onshore domestic manufacturing, which is a great premise. It's one that other people have talked about. An example is the Trump administration had the solar tariff, which actually meant that non-US based solar manufacturing companies had significant incentive to actually bring their manufacturing facilities to the US, which led to 2 or 3 solar facilities being opened. A great example is Jinko opened a solar facility in Georgia, I think in 2018-ish. And Jinko is a massive Chinese solar company, solar manufacturing company. But if you're only looking at domestic manufacturing, that doesn't really solve the problem because you're still going to have to get your materials from somewhere. And that's where we start to look at this right over here. Because in the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a clause that the incentives are applicable for either domestic manufacturing or materials acquired from free trade partners. A few weeks ago, you may have seen headlines about Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, and many people framed it as an ego trip. Why would the Speaker of the House be going to Taiwan? What is the strategic impact? Is this inflaming China? Etc., etc., etc. But what nobody asked is, why is she even in Southeast Asia? The reality is that the Biden administration is currently negotiating an updated version of the TPP, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They are creating a new free trade agreement in Southeast Asia with many of our allies there. So when you look at a map of Asia, you start to see some really interesting opportunities. You can ask yourself, why was Pelosi in Taiwan? And maybe it was just an ego trip. But the reality is that she was there for a very specific strategic reason. Pelosi was in Taiwan and was traveling through Southeast Asia to broker the beginning steps of trade agreements with these countries. So what is the purpose of these? When you look at China, which is one of the biggest economies in the world, if not the biggest economy in the world, and the US reliance on Chinese manufacturing, in that problem there is also an opportunity, because right next to China is India. You also have a massive economy in Southeast Asian countries, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. You have the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. All of these are countries where if they don't currently have the infrastructure to be manufacturing powerhouses, they have the ability and capacity to do so, maybe with a little bit of help. And that is where the genius of the Biden administration comes into play. Because if we go back to this Forbes article, what we see here is that the materials can come from either domestic or free trade partners. Add into that the fact that the Biden administration is currently renegotiating trade agreements in South Asia, and the untapped manufacturing capacity or current manufacturing capacity of many of the surrounding countries around China. And what we see is almost a reverse Belt and Road Initiative. While China wanted to expand outside of Asia in order to increase their soft power, and doing this by getting an economic grip through these infrastructure debt traps, much in the same way that the US did in Central and South America, what we are seeing right now is a drastically different approach from the United States. What the United States, and specifically the Biden administration, is doing is they are, instead of using debt traps to create the economic opportunities that they want the way that the US used to, what the Biden administration is doing is they're using trade partnerships and economic incentives in order to direct economic opportunity towards these countries. So if you think about it, if a buyer for material X, we're just going to make it up, I'm not going to fill in the blank, material X that's normally sourced out of China suddenly has an option to buy that from India, or to buy that from Indonesia, or from Malaysia, or the Philippines, or from Taiwan, and they're able to do that with an incentive, with the tax credit, what they're able to do is you're able to direct the economic opportunity and create a strategy that isolates the Chinese reliance in our supply chains and redirects that away from China to our trade partners and allies. And so what this does is it's a stroke of genius by the Biden administration, because what they are doing is they are demonstrating that the simple fact that access to the US market is a commodity on its own is being used as a point of leverage in these international free trade negotiations in order to isolate the Chinese economy, to reduce the US reliance on Chinese-backed supply chains, to reduce the risk that creates for United States national security, as well as for the national security of many of our allies, as well as to incentivize economic growth in areas of the world that desperately need it. This is the little known and little recognized genius of the Biden administration's geopolitical framework that they are operating from, and I think it deserves more credit.